Welcome to UC Today with me, David Dungay. Today I am joined by CEO of Alianza, Brian Beutler. Welcome to the show, Brian. How are you?
Thank you, David, for having me. It's good to be back. I'm doing great. It's good Monday morning. Off to a good start this week.
Fantastic. Well, it's great to have you back as well, Brian. Today we're going to be talking about leveraging cloud-based platforms, particularly in the service provider space. But before we get into that conversation, Brian, can you give us a quick introduction to yourself and Alianza?
Yeah, you bet. So I'm Brian Beutler, founder and CEO of Alianza. Alianza is the only cloud-native communications platform built exclusively for service providers. So we're helping service providers transform their communications networks to the cloud.
Fantastic. So, Brian, you've got a bit of a recent news which I wanted to touch on, especially around your deal with Lumen. Can you tell us a little bit about this deal and why it was so significant for Alianza?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with the last part of the question first. I mean, it's a big, significant win for Alianza because it's our first publicly announced tier one operator that is ditching the switch, so to speak, and cloud sourcing their communications network with Alianza. Maybe more specifically, why we're really excited about this deal is because it really is kind of pinnacle proof point in the market of everything that Alianza has been talking about for really the last decade. I mean, we've been big on messaging the merits of the cloud and why service providers should be leveraging the cloud to power their cloud communication services. And really just feels like now with Lumen moving, I mean, a much more visible tier one national and even multinational operator, feels like folks, and maybe it's an indicator of where folks in the market are more generally around. Now is the time for operators to seriously consider in mass a move away from the legacy soft switch and into the cloud. And it does, I just think, signal kind of a change here. Like the era of the soft switch is coming to an end, and the era of cloud powering service providers, communications networks is gaining more and more momentum all the time. And so it is really exciting from that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe we could delve into exactly what Lumen are doing. Obviously, they're using your platform to really supercharge some of their UC services portfolio. How are they leveraging Alianza, and what is that giving them in terms of flexibility?
Yeah, David, unlike, or I should say not unlike many operators in the market, Lumen has a voice and a communications network that is full of multiple different vendors, right? So if you look just at the switching infrastructure, I think there's 4 different vendors inside of Lumen that are going to be impacted by this change. And then you look at what the surround sound is around those legacy soft switching infrastructure vendors, and it's dozens of other vendors for everything from billing, remediation, network management, porting infrastructure, fraud prevention, device management, and so forth. I mean, the list goes on and on. And so really what this means for Lumen is a drastic network transformation and network simplification. And I think at its core, what Lumen is trying to accomplish is to compete and win in a marketplace that is much different than it was when they implemented and installed their first soft switch. Right. And if you think about the market generally over the last, call it 10 years since Lumen's installed and managed legacy soft switches, the market for communications and unified communications has changed dramatically. And meanwhile, Lumen's been stuck with the soft switch they put in 10 years ago. And I think they're increasingly hearing from customers that we want more on the innovation front. We want more extensibility. We want more interoperability. We just want a richer, more feature-full communications experience that goes beyond basic voice. That's enabled by the soft switch. And so this change is really in an effort to put Lumen back on a growth trajectory, back on an innovation trajectory, really back at the forefront of product differentiation, and give them a solution that their sales teams and their channel partners and their customers can be proud of.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about differentiation, isn't it? And a lot of these players, and not just Lumen, but many others in the market as well. They've been fighting against a lot of the OTT players, haven't they, over the last 5+ years or so.
Yeah.
How is that gap now going to be closed with platforms like this that are native cloud based? How does that enable them to compete with those OTT providers?
Yeah, I think that's a game changer, right? I mean, if you look at what the marketplace that some of the leading innovative OTT operators have faced over the last decade, they've had pretty fertile ground in the marketplace to compete. Let's call it that. Where they've definitely had a differentiation advantage, an innovation advantage, because they own their own proprietary cloud platforms, and they've been able to innovate at a pace that service providers on legacy switching infrastructure have just not been able to keep up with. And yet, the service providers have so much inherent defensible competitive advantage because they own the network, because they have local resources in the cities and towns where their customers are located. They're able to bundle services with broadband and really flex their muscle with all the broadband assets they have in place. And that local infrastructure and local support is a big deal. But they've lost share to OTT because they haven't had an agile, cloud-first, extensible product stack. And that's where I think this is really exciting, because we're able to take Alianza's differentiated cloud offering and power the service providers in a new way where they really get the best in class cloud solution with their broadband advantages. And when you combine those two, I think the marketplace over the next decade plus is going to look a lot different than it has over the last decade. I think service providers are going to be much better positioned with Alianza to compete and win against OTT competitors.
Wow. So in the context of the sort of the wider market, then this is a bit of an interesting time in history from your point of view. You think we're all going to be looking back at this kind of period, thinking that that's when it all changed?
Yeah, I think we are. I think we're going to look back and we're going to say, hey, 2021, 2022, 2023 is when really like the tide turned for service providers. And after a decade of maybe the tide flowing out, the next decade is the tide coming back in and the market really moving in their direction rather than against them. And I think it's a really exciting time to be a service provider. I mean, certainly there's challenges, but I think the world needs great communication services and applications at better, with better service, better support, better local touch, better install experience, better digital first experience than they ever have before. And there's nobody better positioned in the market to deliver what those enterprise customers want than service providers. So yeah, I think it's a really fun time to be a service provider and a great time to be powering their communication stack.
Well, let's hone in on some of those differentiators. You mentioned a few, already. How can these service providers really, get to that point, where they can be, best at, this, that, and the other over the next, few years or so? How are they going to build this differentiated offering with this cloud-based platform?
Yeah, I think it starts with like the whole digital experience for customers, right? Making it easy for customers at every step of the journey. In the past, when service providers have had these legacy soft switches, literally there is a switch tech that needs to go touch something that's in between the customer and the feature enablement or feature enhancement or additional line they want to add. That's just so old school and it has to change. And Alianza is really enabling a digital first, digital only experience for the customer, from provisioning through porting, through sign up of services and lighting up features and functionality, to adding another user, to managing those users, to supporting your existing infrastructure, is all done digitally in a web first, modern interface that make it really easy for the customer to self-support and self-sign up without ever talking to the service provider. And on the rare occasion when they do need to call the service provider is so much more capable now on Alianza of things like first call resolution, managing services dynamically while the customer's on the call, making sure that customer, if they do have to call, they only have to call once. They get it done in real time live when they're on the call. So I think it starts with kind of that digital experience and just making sure that in kind of that always on, always available kind of drive for instant results marketplace that we live in, that service providers are no longer tied to this legacy switching infrastructure that is antithetical to what the market wants on that front. And then the second big thing I would point out, David, is customers really do want a full-featured functional experience that is not just delivered in a web experience, but is delivered by local people that they know and trust, right? And this is where, like, when you talk about how do they differentiate in the marketplace, we actually commissioned a survey last year where we went out and talked with something like 700 small business owners. and ask them that, given if all else were equal, do they have a preference to purchase communication services from their local broadband provider or from a national over-the-top provider that might not have a local presence in their area? Overwhelmingly, super majority said, well, of course, I'd love to purchase from my local provider. And I think that's like really encouraging for service providers to look at data like that and say, hey, if we have the product and we bundle it with our broadband services, our customers want to purchase from us. Like literally, like they want to put wind in our sails. They want to move the market towards the local providers. They just need the product that powers it. And so I think as far as, maybe the third level of differentiation here is when service providers really start to bundle and think about pricing advantage against OTT. I think if we look at kind of the pure play UC collaboration application marketplace, feels like Microsoft's starting to pull away and create some clear leadership in that space. And I think part of that has to do with just their ability, their differentiated ability to bundle the cloud meetings experience with the Microsoft Office and Productivity Suite. And I think service providers have a very similar advantage in the middle of the market to bundle services with their broadband at price points and in ways that are just much more consumable and differentiated. And I think that's just going to be a natural kind of outcome as this market matures. We'll see service providers do more and more of that type of activity to really set themselves apart.
Sure. So, I mean, we've spoken about, how this market's going to mature over the next 10 years. What I guess is maybe slightly harder to predict is how is it going to go over the next 2, 3, 4 years? What are you expecting to see from this space? What kind of evolution are you expecting to see in the more sort of near term for this service provider landscape?
Yeah, totally. I think maybe the biggest thing I would point out is what we're not going to see in this space over the next year to 3 years, and that is service providers deploying more soft switches. Right? That's just clearly, like, as we talk with operators out there, that's just the biggest non-starter out there. Is the era of deploying more soft switches or continuing to invest in more legacy infrastructure, like those days are just gone and behind us. And operators are en masse trying to figure out, what are we going to do to really compete and win in the cloud communications marketplace? And I think the first decision there is what we're not going to do, kind of, trying to, the old definition of insanity, right? Continuing to do the same thing the same way and expecting different results. I think service providers have listened to that and said, all right, we are definitely not putting in another legacy soft switch anytime soon.
Fantastic. Well, look, Brian, it's been absolutely great to talk to you as always. I think that's a great place to end today's discussion. Thank you so much for joining me and sharing some of your insights.
Yes, David, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
And thank you for watching. You've been watching me, David Dungay, on UC Today. If you liked today's conversation, please give us a like and a share on social media. That's it from me. See you next time.